Okay, everybody, I'm gonna get started, and we're not going to use any big technology today in Zoom, other than perhaps some questions and answers in the chat. So good morning and happy Saturday. Super happy to be here with everybody. If everybody could take a moment and put into chat what organization that you're from, because and maybe what role that you play, because it's a really interesting input as I have the discussion with you guys. That would be great. Just put it into that Zoom chat if you guys. That little chat bar for Zoom is always hard to find. So it's under the little control bar and more. Maybe not. That's okay. If everybody doesn't want to. Cool, thanks. Awesome. Great. Oregon Health Science University. Oh, I'm glad. Welcome from Oregon. Awesome. Okay, great. Oh, good. Slack. I love Slack. Slack is awesome. Cool, great. Okay, I'm gonna jump in. It looks like a lot of higher education, which is great. So you guys, and municipal government services. So this is actually a really interesting thing for everybody probably. My name is Amy Hannaford, and in the light of COVID events, I used to be the CEO and principal architect of Hook 42, but I am representing myself today. It's fun and interesting. I have a lot of letters. That means I do a lot of accessibility and program and process management, and all sorts of fun things. And I love Stanford because that S1 is my Stanford certified project manager. So I'm gonna set some expectations here. The pandemic has really drastically impacted the world, as I just mentioned myself personally, pretty heavily. Please be patient and kind. And this session has a generic design because I didn't have time. So for those of you who've known generics in the past, here's a little bit of a gallows humor. So it's really not prepared for accessibility. Like I didn't put the closed captions on or anything like that, but it still has some substance, and I'll get a copy of this up on the website, you guys, so it can be reviewed by the team. Also, as I go through this session, I will refer to multilingual as ML and accessibility as A11Y. Both of the topics are big and complex. So when we combine the two, it really increases complexity. So we're gonna cover big concepts here, and I'm gonna assume that everybody here has some collective accessibility knowledge, especially as I look from every one that's coming. And hi, Carol, yay, you're here. I'm gonna assume some collective web accessibility knowledge. So I want you to ask questions along the way to gauge these. You can type questions into chat. And I ran a remote company for a long time, so I can watch questions in chat and respond pretty quickly. So it'll be great. So, okay. First of all, as we go through all of what we talk about, I'm assuming that the people doing the work here are following best practices and standards in web, in multilingual, in accessibility, in best practice, or in process improvement and that type of thing, in testing. I'm also assuming skilled team members will perform work discussed. And also specialists for each one of your organizations and your technology ecosystem must architect the most viable solution for your organization's needs. Everybody is different. Everybody's technology stack is different, and skills are different, and constraints are different. So we'll talk about concepts and understanding, and then your takeaway is like, oh, how do I stick this in my environment? Big disclaimer, this session is for information only and does not represent any legal advice. So that's what your lawyers are for. So I will continue on. Our session goals really here is to gain understanding, and we'll surface concepts, considerations, and challenges along the way. To reach our goals, we're going to talk about mutual considerations of multilingual and accessibility. We're going to talk an overview of multilingual implementations, common ones. We're going to highlight some language-specific accessibility needs, talk about some compliance challenges, and the impact to processes and workflow. So a nice overarching breadth of things. I pressed the wrong button. Here we go. So some mutual considerations between multilingual and accessibility include, these are just some, but these are the big ones: legal considerations, design, development, comprehension, and that's an interesting word. I'll get into that in a second. Testing and workflow, and I'm going to use the word workflow really loose in this because there's so many that you can use: process, and you can use workflow, and all sorts of different things. So workflow in the state of what we're having a conversation is just the order in which activities take place. At the legal level, a lot of organizations, many of you guys here, have accessibility compliance. And yes, Chaz, that's good. If you guys watch the chat, there's some interesting comments coming up here. So at the legal level, as many of you know here, there is accessibility compliance, and that is most commonly for government agencies, higher education, and very specific industries, although most other industries are actually getting hit with compliance adherence cases. There's also many international laws, and the reason why I bring international up is because if you have a multilingual website, it's not just, you might be targeting markets that are not just within the US. So accessibility has international laws. Most use WCAG 2.0 as a standard for their baseline, as well as the US using 508 compliance, which leverages WCAG 2.0 as a baseline. So the takeaway from this is leverage WCAG 2.0 and as your stable baseline, and it's going to be a really good foundation. I'm using 508 and WCAG is just mentioning that I'm assuming that the team has some accessibility knowledge coming into this session. As for multilingual requirements, very often you are required, if you have a specific industry vertical and that you get funding from the government in some place, and you have serving a specific population that are non-English speakers, you must provide population of certain percentages a non-English copy of your website. For example, healthcare, government contract, Spanish population in California. I worked at HealthNet. I had to implement the fastest multilingual Spanish site ever because the population hit very quickly to a certain threshold, and we needed to implement a whole translated Spanish site very quickly. Also, many countries have multiple official languages. So if you're doing business in specific countries and are under their any of their funding or laws, you need to take into consideration that Canada has 2 languages. Other companies have more than one as well. Countries. It's so Saturday at home. Sorry, guys. Okay, so in design for both multilingual and accessibility, we have to really take into account layout, the structure of the page, the structure of the content, negative space, reflow, which is the wrapping of type of entities, and the effects of zoom on your site. Now you're like, why do you have to do that for multilingual? You have to do it for all sites, but as you get through into fonts and text representation, You have to select fonts that are going to be accessible tech, to folks. Also the size, like German is a really, really large language. So something very small in English can be a very large word in English. So as you take your layout and font selection and size and colors into account, and wrapping and heading selection, heading designs, all of those things need to take into account what are the multilingual content that you're going to be dealing with. Also, media. Are you putting text in images? Do you have videos on your site? And you're like, oh yeah, I closed caption those, I'm totally accessible, but is that video in another language? Does it have to be in another language? Are you going to translate those closed captions? Do you have all those types of things? So also infographics, if you're using infographics through the course of your business, do you have not only text-based alternatives, but text-based alternatives in different languages? And then also when you need to take into account navigation for menus and blocks of content and headings, mostly for like the font shape and size of content. For development, semantic HTML is good for everyone. It's good for both. Also, both systems use specialized markup to surface text strings, and it depends what technology you're using. If you're using Drupal, people might have heard of the T tag or the trans tag. But also, if you're using a different type of system, you'll need to surface strings for multilingual in different ways. Also, there's ARIA. So ARIA is specialized markup to surface text strings to the string reader. So there's both use specialized text strings that might not be blatantly obvious to somebody working on a web system. They also required additional technology configuration, supporting libraries and possible integrations, such as a translation management system or Google Translate. They require additional training and skills, testing tools, including manual testing, and both of these require full coverage best practices adherence across the board for content, technology, accessibility, that type of thing. Comprehension, comprehension is huge for accessibility. So it's not just about, is your code compliant and can the screen reader read it? It is, can the person understand what content that you're reading? So to use the plain language content approach in all languages is write your content in a way that most people will understand it. For example, content reading level in English, very commonly, a lot of people focus on the 9th grade level, but people are really, really more comfortable reading down to the 2 grade levels below that. But it's very clear for multilingual that you want to make sure that people are understanding what you're trying to say from your source language translation. Because you can translate words, but are you translating the meaning? And this often comes with colloquialisms, localized messaging, and that type of thing. And then also, this comes through to content structure of what's in your headings, what your paragraph structures look like, what do your sentence structures look like? How are you using tabular data? Your text-based alternatives, like I mentioned for your infographics, like diagrams and charts, but also your language delivery. So do you have anything that's like a visual language delivery? What do you see? What do you hear? But also haptic, right? What is that word, haptic? What can you feel? How is it moving to your responsive Braille interface? You know, this is real. It's not just what you see or what you hear, but also how is the language going to translate into your other assistive devices. We get into testing. Both use specific tools. The multilingual doesn't have as a ton of specific tools. Mostly you have to use a lot of SEO focused type of things to pull out the metadata. It depends on the technology that you're using. Most often it's like, why is that piece of text not translated on my page? Why isn't it getting to the site? So those things come into manual testing. Both need manual testing for comprehension and also you know, a lot like a lot of automated tools can't check zoom levels or reflow or anything. And then there's very, very specific user testing. So as you get into accessibility, hey, I would like to have somebody that's blind or low sight, but now, oh, is it blind, low sight within the region that I'm working in? So it's a little bit challenging. It makes it harder to find those folks. Also, do you have test coverage covering both of your multilingual and accessible work and the processes itself? And then also both, do you have validation and proof of compliance? Because like I remember, you know, when we had to switch that multilingual site very quickly, we had to reach, I believe at that point, it was like 80% strings translated on the site. So we had to prove that we have had 80% of the site translated. And for accessibility, you have to have proof of some level of compliance and some level of being able to adhere to compliance. And that comes into different testing tools and testing software suites. So workflow is a huge thing that impacts both. It's like, first of all, glossaries, taxonomies, and structural content. You're like, why is that part of my accessible workflow? It's huge for multilingual because it's setting up your consistent terminology used across the site, but that's the exact reason why it's good for accessibility. It's setting up your consistent terminology and language, how you speak about your products, your content, your services, everything, and it's continue across the site because it gives you the most consistent, predictable, understandable interface to a website. Also, you have initial content creation is both it's a huge thing for both of the multilingual and accessible sites. So the first initial content creation is important to get it right the first time. For both. One is to reduce the amount of time it's going to take to do back and forth error testing for accessibility. The other one is you're going to send that content to a translator. You're probably paying money for that person, whether it be an internal staff or your professional translation services. You don't want to pay that money over and over again. You also have fast time in the market. You want to make sure that you get things right the first time. And that kind of ties right into that content review and validation, when to publish it, when is it okay, and that time to market activity. So I'm going to move into Multilingual Web Overview. So the really specific multilingual topics are design, page rendering, development itself, and the content process for multilingual. So specifically for multilingual design, you have to throw in right to left layouts. How many people in accessibility are like if I looked on all sorts of it doesn't say right to left layouts in WCAG. It says, can you navigate? Can you get through? Is it clear? But also it needs to be clear in Arabic or another right to left layout. There's long words and and symbols, right? So this is where German, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a very, very long word. But also symbols, are you using Japanese or Chinese? How is that going to work within your design? Can you see those font elements clearly enough? Also, are you using text and images? Because if you are, then when that image shows up on another version of the page, you need to make sure that image changes with multilingual text in there. And then also supporting text. A lot of people forget that labels and menus and everything are also subject to large words and small space, and tiny fonts. And also consider use of SVGs in your workflow. Multilingual page rendering. Now this is interesting. There's two main ways for multilingual rendering on the top. One is native and one is a proxy. So if it's a native multilingual page rendering, languages are rendered directly from code or the CMS, right? It's basically like hard-coded HTML or the output of that. So if you're using the Drupal core language structure, if you're using Adobe AEM native linguistic support, those types of things present you into having like the multilingual pages being displayed as a page itself. The multilingual information is in the page itself. This page rendering is often integrated with a third-party TMS to provide multilingual translations, and that happens before the page renders, like well before it. It happens offline, it comes back in, and then you publish the page, but the page itself is in your website. The multilingual content is in your CMS system. It is all there. Now there's a multilingual page rendering. That's a proxy format. And translations are added with a JavaScript overlay, and it's served from a translation management service. Who's heard of Google Translate widget on the site? Huh? Yeah? Fun. That is like an on-site JavaScript layover where it lays over the translations on top of the site. They also have a Google Translate Chrome plugin. There's also paid software as a services that provide this quick, relatively quick translation method to just put that proxy over it. It's like TransFX, Smartly, Global Delivery Network, and SDL proxy. But some proxies require additional development to support decoupled sites because they expect that decoupled sites kind of acts like HTML, but it's not necessarily works really smoothly with their JavaScript. They also have impact to, you know, do you have a very specific page or URL for those types of pages? How does that work? And there are also some custom development that you need to do to actually get full coverage on one of those proxy services. Some fun facts about the Google Translate widget. The website plugin is no longer supported. So, thanks, Chaz. The SFMTA uses Google Translate for content that won't human translate, but they don't. It's for costs and everything. And that they are they're not accepting new sites. I wonder where the widget will be continued to be supported. They are saying that they're not going to, it can just go anytime. They're saying a nice legal, like, hey, we can just take it away. That's what's gonna happen. So the quality of the website is it's not supported anymore because the quality of machine translations reduced by overuse. Like Google was using all of its sites crawling and the different crawling of different sites that were human translated. That was feeding their translation machine learning, and they just said, oh nope, that's reducing the quality of. Like too many things are using machine translation now to get out there, and so that was reducing the quality of their translation logic. So at the user level, you can use Google Chrome Translate plugin, browser plugin. So some of the development considerations, be mindful when embedding text strings in code, right? Like you're making a custom module, or you're like, hey, I got this big wad of HTML. I'm just gonna stick it in a code. I'm gonna stick it in a custom block. I'm gonna use some Drupal terms. I'm gonna put that through my HTML. But then you know what, at some point, you're gonna need to translate it possibly if you need to have full translation coverage on your site. Also, you might need to tune it for accessibility. That makes it interesting to actually have to go into your full software development lifecycle to change text all the time. It's not something your developers probably want to do often. So you want to surface text for content editor modifications. Now, with multilingual, you can define explicit language on the page, like the HTML, and also sections of the page. And then also, Forms are a big deal, both native and third-party integrations. And this is when I do lots of multilingual audits and have done this for years. Form listing, form posting to the right locale, form everything around forms. Just like multilingual is you need to take a very mindful, very detailed, oriented approach to making sure you get everything covered. And also, all of that hidden and less obvious content needs to be considered. Page metadata, the open graph, social information, href links, URLs, all of the type of like hidden things that you don't expect need to come out. Also, this is something that's really interesting. It's a kind of a crossover. There is, you know, if you need to have a synonym code wrapped around some types of things, like so SFMTA has a synonym code, or sorry, it's not. It's so morning for me. But anyway, I'll show you a code sample of it. But if you have to wrap it at the content editor level and embed text, you want to make sure that all the text is going to be available to any translator to change later. So. On your multilingual content workflow, the source content, I'm going to strongly say, must be final for translation before things are published or moves on into a workflow. Often this could be a legal review. It could, and also, you know, because human professional translation costs money, you want to make sure things are final before it goes on to the next step. Machine translation impacts content comprehension. So even though you might want to consider having those additional languages there, it does impact comprehension, and that impacts accessibility. So even though you're like, yeah, cool, I'm going to get this language on this page, is that going to actually give the information that they need? Because the words aren't, the comprehension decreases. So, and then also translations commonly take place in a TMS system that may not have the full context of what you're looking at. They might be translating a bit. They might not have all images right next to things. So you might be sending alt text over to be translated, but they don't see what's happening. So you have to be mindful at that very beginning of that source content to make sure, hey, do you do accessibility testing for the content before the final for translation activity? So these are just food for thoughts. It depends on the content that you're working with. It can depend on your legal requirements for content publication. So here's a nice multilingual team. There's a lot of people here just to make multilingual work. And this is a realistic explanation. So you've got project managers, developers, designers, CMS specialists, SEM specialists, publishers, all sorts of things. So many people all making sure that the client can have a lovely multilingual site. And then here's a visualization of a basic workflow. So developers supply the source, and then it goes on through. So I'm just going to move on because I'm seeing the time. So accessibility language considerations. So now I'm going to put on the accessible hat. I am now the accessibility specialist, and there are certain things with language that we need to consider. And so what, a little bit about multilingual accessibility coverage, accessible technology and language. And then also we're going to discuss some WCAG success criteria with language. So first of all, as you put both of these things together, multilingual and accessibility, you just need to identify your needs for both the legal and business end. Even though you have multilingual on the site and the site needs to be accessible, there's only a limited amount of time and money and everything within your own organization constraints. It becomes adding more languages to sites become exponential in testing and use cases, right? Especially because editorial content is a huge source of compliant issues, because you can do your best to get your themes clear and your navigation standard, because those are all like global centered. But wow, what happens when somebody makes a really, really like hard to read page with a lot of content that's hard in between and that's not accessible? It will fail. That page will fail accessibility. That might go through all the way through the translations. You might have many pages that are failing accessibility, but we need to balance the process within your org constraints. So part of this is finding when and where to most efficiently put accessibility testing and multilingual testing together. And that's a balance. As you go through testing with multilingual sites, we have to take into consideration that the operating systems provide multiple languages. They also provide multiple synthesizers. A synthesizer is what creates text to speech. So this feeds screen readers. And there are lots of different synthesizers that exist for different regions, locales, tone of reader, that type of thing. And what about Braille? I talked about haptic feedback before. Well, Braille isn't a language. Braille is a it's basically a it's a method to it's basically it's not a language. It's just a method to tell you what the letters are. Sorry, my notes aren't here. My notes are on my. There's no screen. It's just sharing this. But Braille is not a language. So what happens is, if you're familiar with the term transliteration, transliteration is when you can take perhaps like a French word that has special characters like an accent aigu or something, and you pull it down into like the Western alphabet. So you take off the accents and everything. It's very similar to what Braille does. So Braille was created on the French alphabet, but French is based on the Latin alphabet, just like ours. And so what basically, for all of the different alphabets, they translate it to a very, very phonetic tie into a Braille alphabet. So like that neat curvy B in German ties to the B phonetically in Braille, like the English B. So it's really interesting. Sorry, I got all excited about that. I'm like, I want to share Braille. It's such a neat case. But what it comes down to is you just need to make sure that whatever whatever language your site is in, it should be clear content. And also, excessive technology requires semantic HTML to function correctly. And the language covers, it differs across the different accessible technologies. So if you're using one screen reader, like NVDA, it might have a lot more coverage than JAWS, but JAWS might have higher quality. So you've got all sorts of these different variants when you're working with accessible technology and language. For multilingual design, we talked a lot about reflow size, text spacing, font, and text size, text-based buttons, right? Because buttons may be small, buttons may be big, but you have to check, are they working? Does the translation actually fit? And can they still use it? Also, people, and I missed a close paren on that. People forget with language switchers that they're like, oh, I'm just gonna put a flag, right? Or a language code. But sometimes that might not be clear enough for like giving the right representation. You might need to put English, or you might display EN, or display the US flag or the Great Britain flag for whatever region that you're focusing on. And you might want to use some ARIA to say, hey, this is English, if you don't want to display it as EN. So also consider, like I said, images of text, and consider not using them, honestly. Like, don't use them very often, because every time you're doing multilingual design, you need to pull in your design testing across all languages, hopefully. Like if you have an accessible design that you're working with, throw every known language you have to do it with your content structure, like constraints. Like, you know, sometimes you don't want to have a header that's way too big, but you might want to take some of your representative content that might be on the larger side, and then push that through translation to one of your most long languages like German or something, and see what that does to your design. And then also your media approach should be considered in all of multilingual, because where is your alt text coming from? Is it coming from a digital asset management system that's integrated to the site? When does it get translated? Who's doing the translation? Who does the alt text creation? Does alt text change in the context of the picture used on the page? Ah, so many things. So all of those just need to be considered as you are doing a multilingual accessible design. This is really easy, this one's easy. The language of the page should be on the page, because that tells the screen readers what to do. The language of parts should be around the page. So if anybody has gone to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they have a page that has lots of different languages on the page. And it's an English site, and they'll have very many languages to say, oh, download the manual here. Here's your learning guide, that type of thing. That would look something that's here. It's interesting. I'll show you in a second. I'm going to come out of full screen mode. Both of these require the website and CMS configuration correctly created. For in-page content, the editor tools, training, and TMS processes must be aware of when you have embedded languages in here, because translation management systems have memory, and if you don't identify that this is French, but you're coming from an English page, it will process that into your English source translation memory, and it will muddle it all up. It will make your source bad. So can you guys still see this? Okay, so for example, this is a wonderfully simple site, and it's from JAWS, or from the company that makes JAWS. So you can see here's the HTML lang is English. Here's an example of an acronym right here that has additional text that someone just can't see on the site, but needs to be possibly translated. And then you can see here this in English, and then you can see that, hey, I'm going to put a French word right in the middle. And if you span that, or if you encapsulate that information in a language code, then the screen readers will be like, oh, cool, thank you. That is, I'm going to read that language. But also the search engines will be like, oh, cool, you're not misrepresenting the language on this page. It's not going to catch you for that. So the challenges with that just come into play with making sure that your editor tools, training, and the TMS processes take that use case into an account. As I'm out of presentation mode, here's an example of the Sonoma County Library. Here's the Google Translate widget, lots of different languages here. Here's an example of text-based images, and they have one here. Yeah, I can do that, Carol, thanks. Here's the text-based images, and then if you move on, oh, look it, there's the English one. So it is most important because they're like California has one of the highest populations of non-English speaking residents, and Spanish is the top language. So this is where an example of they put this, even though it's on an English page, they wanted that information to be consumed by the most people the quickest. So let me get this here. Yeah, isn't that a wonderfully simple, straightforward sample? I liked it. And also, if you want to get the Google Translate widget, you can get it from here. Because I was like, oh my gosh, where can I get it? Because I was going to stick it in the page, but you can find it. It's out there. You can download stuff. It's all over the place. I am not saying download it because they're saying it's not supported, but it's kind of fun. It's real. This is, the situation is real, because it was so funny, because it was so easy to do that as the go-to, like, oh yeah, I'm totally gonna get that. But as you use these proxies, does it get anything that's like a hidden label or error message that's coming from the system or anything? Like, these proxies sometimes miss key multilingual text components that are required for accessible compliance. So you have to really, really take into an account in any of your system. And so all of the success criteria that might have translatable text is non-text alternatives everywhere, errors, labels, and messages, audio descriptions, and closed captions. Sign language, whoa, hey, AAA compliant. Who are you speaking to? Are you using, American Sign Language? Are you using an international version of sign language? Crazy. Now, because WCAG is, 508 is going to, of course, well, I'm not even going to say any more legal stuff. So anyway, y'all can look at sign language. That sign language guy for the COVID stuff has been amazing. I don't know if you've been watching him translate the health. Oh my gosh, he's amazing. So anyway, the challenges here is just making sure you're rendering the translated versions correctly and in context of the media. The workflow is interesting because you need to surface these non-text alternatives, what that might be within the system or in a user interface area or custom code. You need to surface them, translate them, test them, and publish the language variants, and then also test them in an accessible area too. Challenges with compliance. It's law. Is it a choice versus a requirement? And I love accessibility. And for multilingual, choice is to increase market reach, right? I want to get into more markets. Also, the greater good for both. It's more accessible to have your content in different languages and a good accessibility. But mostly people need to do it because it's required. And that requirement comes from all level scopes. So it's municipal, state, and federal. Also, there are organizations that may make sure that compliance and accessibility support is really a forefront of their initiatives. So, but the big push comes from, like, if you're receiving funding from anything government, you must make sure that you have level of compliance. So, and I also talked a little bit about the high population is English speaking, and then also the word is essential services. What is essential services? But this is really a real deal right now. What is it? What needs to be translated? What really is an essential service, right? So yes, the libraries being open, that's an essential service. Health, and all sorts of, like, any of the municipal support systems are hugely important.
Just really quick, Amy.
I'm almost done.
Oh, okay, great. Then I'll leave you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. We're all good. I've been watching the time.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So proof of compliance. So this is hard because a lot of times you can use things like Cite Improve or all these other wonderful things that will give you an accessible compliance score. But there's a lot of, like, reading level tools that don't exist for non-English. Like, you can use Flesch Kincaid on German, but it's not going to work because it's a reading level algorithm that's meant for English. Also, spell checking if you haven't configured your tools to properly spell check your language. Also, what's interesting is if you would like to explore manual testing that is at a specific level, regardless of its multilingual and multilingual accessibility, the Trusted Tester program from the DHS, Department of Homeland Services, is a fantastic ICT baseline that it exists. But then also that it's really interesting for that proof of time quality scores, and that's the quantification of compliance. That's always hard. So the cost of compliance, I don't know when you're going to do your content, accessibility tests. How much is automatic? How much is manual? How often are you going to do this? Also, what is the cost of your accessibility requirement? Like if you're out of compliance, how much is it going to cost you? And that's going to be different from either your language access laws and accessibility. The last one is the workflow impact, and I'll post this up, you guys can read this. So source content workflow, what does the first one look like? Where do you do a test there? The translation content workflow, like how does it actually get translated? There's localization workflow, and localization is when you're not translating it, but you're targeting the information for that region, right? So that's his locale specific content. Then there's content specific success criteria, like we talked about, alt text, colloquialisms, slang. I worked at Electronic Arts, and we had to make sure all sorts of like crazy slang was translated in the game in a way that was fitting for each region and not offensive. It was a real big challenge. Specialized content workflows, including digital asset management systems, any end-to-end processes for accessibility, like a checkout system, all of those things you need to make sure that you look at. And anytime you have an API or JSON feeds, anything like that. And then also make sure in the content publication lifecycle for all languages, this really ties into your proof of public access. When did it go live? When was it fixed? How long was it bad? How do you manage those changes over time? And if you kick off another change to that page that requires a translation, it also requires accessibility testing. And what does change mean, and how does that trigger your testing? So here's a bunch of these questions that I've been saying. So I'm not going to read them again. One of the big things is, who do you train? Who is testing? What are you testing and where? And some external considerations. The translations happen outside the CMS and are returned to the website, whether they be machine translation and that type of thing. Or professional translators, they can be changed without control, because do I train a translator to make sure that they're accessible while making accessible content while they're translating? Well, they change without control, because a lot of times people are paying a third party to actually do that work, do the translations. But then also, how do your third party integrate systems support multilingual accessibility? And let's just say, like, oh yeah, I've got Eloqua forms or a HubSpot form. I need to capture that, a CRM, I need to capture that information. I need to embed this with an iframe, or, like, there's so many weird ways of making sure that form data is relevant to all your systems, and then also all of those other pieces are translated. Everybody forgets those things. It's like, no, those are the hard ones, don't forget it. And then also perform audits. So personally, I've been doing audits for over 25 years in enterprise tech, process, and multilingual, and accessibility audits for 4 years. I've been training a bunch of people to do those too. For multilingual, we do audits to preparation for translation to make sure that your system is set up to surface these strings, and that you have an efficient translation process. Also, with accessibility, you want to tie this comprehensive testing into the overall process, so you can capture things over time, because you can't do everything with just automated tests. And you can use audits for a nice starting point, like how bad is it? What remediation do I need to take? Or you can do them as a spot check along the way, spot checks for very new features, or you can do a moment to confirm your baseline. So, and then That's just because I didn't want to find another picture. Your accessible multilingual team has your accessibility governance team there, accessibility testers and accessibility testing tools, and then all of the people you see should have some training in accessibility so they can actually do have both mindsets at the same time. Okay, do you guys want to have questions at all? Is there anything? I've been watching that. Oh, that's actually a good question, Chaz. Do we warn people accessing one of our translations that the following a particular link to untranslated content, that the link target is in English? Usability wise, you might want to have it very clear. If you can have a link go to the same language, it's preferred. So, you know, you can put things like English, you know, in the link text, or, you know, just to, like, basically with accessibility, you want to make sure that things are predictable and things don't change for the users interacting with content that are surprising. So it's probably more surprising if that target jumps out to another window than it is. It's like similar to the little external site, you know, that little external site image that people use, and they have a little bit of text saying, oh yeah, you're leaving my site now. You might want to do something similar to that, just put the language next to it. But that's a really interesting question. that actually is way more of a usability, like how to make the best design and like overall usable experience. Yeah. Anybody, any other questions along the way? Yeah, Carol.
One thing I don't know much about SVGs, and I don't know much. We really don't have much time because lunch is starting soon. But I didn't realize that you can put text in an SVG. How does that work? Can you talk a little bit about those?
Oh yeah, that's a big session.
Okay, never mind. I'll look it up.
No. It's the simplicity. Yes, an SVG, you can have text bundled in it, and that makes it easier for accessible information, and that you can translate it. The challenge with some of those is how complex is that SVG? Like, is it a map that's a rollover? Like, is it really crazy, or is it just going to be a very targeted little SVG, like a social media icon or something? So the impact to the translation part of side of those things is like, where do you put that translated code? Because that big complex like map that needs to be translated, I would make sure that goes through a different, like, that's like a source code translation process. That doesn't change very often. But if it's going to be like because a lot of people, like, you know, they have the Drupal SVG kind of widget things now that you can pop in, and you just want to make sure if the SVG is surfaced to your content editors to actually create, everybody is trained, and the systems are created that you can split out any text that's in it to be translated if you need that translation plus accessibility coverage. But a lot of times, like if it's like social media links, a lot of them, it's like you're not translating Facebook's Facebook, right? Or LinkedIn's LinkedIn. So it's when you get into, and your logos, you're gonna have your logos, so it shouldn't be, those don't necessarily get translated. It's when you get into like, oh, here's the instructions for a sewing machine, you know, and it's from, you know, it's a JPEG, and it has like here, flip this thing up, and those are the types of things. Those aren't necessarily SVGs, but those are images, but that's the type of tricky stuff you have to deal with. And also if your SVG is actually just to make sure you can put scalable text in an image-like format, you want to really make sure that that has the text in there to provide the non-text the text-based alternative. Okay, that was the quick SVG answer in context. Anything else, anybody? Okay.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
I was going to say, was this helpful?
It was a lot.
It was helpful, though. I definitely learned some stuff and was adding user stories to our product backlog while you were talking. Of stuff I learned.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Amy.
Oh, yay. Thank you, guys. I can talk more with you guys if you want. So, all right. Take care, everybody. I'll post this on my on the page nodes soon. I'll clean up the notes so you guys have some more context. So,
Sounds
right.
good. Thanks again, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
All
See you
right.
guys later.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.